here are the things we're going to add. We'll get the additions going. Then we'll talk about what we're going to reduce. And then have a conversation. What we're going to eliminate. And then if you're going to eliminate something, get it out of your line of sight.
How have you been able to heal essentially your autoimmune condition with food?
Well, it began by zeroing in on the mitochondria. When I was going relentlessly downhill, I'm in a tilt-recline wheelchair. I'm taking mitoxantrone, which, to suppress the immune system. I take Tysabri, which is, we're very excited and I'm thrilled to take. It's the new biologic that will turn off the immune cells so effectively, it reduces relapse rate by 68%.
Wow.
Really huge. And still one of the most potent disease-modifying drugs. But, that didn't help. I was still going downhill. And eventually, I switched to another drug, Cellcept. And I finally, it was very clear that I was probably on track to become bedridden, demented. I have trigeminal neuralgia, and those were getting more frequent, more difficult to turn off. And I knew I would likely have that turn permanently on and then have to deal with this horrific, constant electrical face pain. So I was like, okay, am I really doing everything that I can? And I started reading the basic science, which was a chore because I'm not a neurologist. I don't have a PhD. And I began looking for supplement studies to help with Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cognitive decline, because it was my thinking that my problem was the mitochondria were not making enough energy, and that was what was causing progressive disability for Parkinson's, for cognitive decline, for Alzheimer's, and probably for what I had, because I really hadn't had any relapses for years. And so that was back in 2004. I'm in the tilt recline wheelchair. I have profound fatigue. And I have this theory that mitochondria are the drivers. And so I look for supplements to start supporting my mitochondria. And, after 6 months, the internal conventional skeptic doc rose up and said, "You're wasting your money." And I quit everything. Because I couldn't perceive that those supplements had done anything for me, Max. And for the next day, nothing changed. But 36 hours into it, my fatigue was even more severe. I just really couldn't get out of bed. And after 72 hours of not being able to get out of bed, Jackie comes in and says, honey, why don't you take these again? And so I took my little supplement cocktail. The next morning, I could get up. Now, I was still fatigued, but I'm back to my usual level of fatigue. And I went to work. And I was like so excited. Like, okay, maybe those supplements are doing something after all. And then Jack and I had a conversation. We decided that I would test it out again in about 2 weeks. So again, I stopped all of my supplements. And the first 24 hours was okay. But at 36 hours, I couldn't get out of bed again. And I waited 72 hours. Then I started everything up again. And I could again get up and go to work the next morning. So now I'm very excited. Like, okay, I'm figuring something out that my neurologist didn't know to tell me about, that my primary care doc didn't know to tell me about. And now I'm really excited to, well, what else can I learn about mitochondria? And what else could I learn from reading the research? And I go find some biochemistry books, and I'm looking, okay, let's go back at the Krebs cycle, take a look at that again. What else should I be doing?
Fascinating. What were some of those supplements, if you can share? Like,
Yeah, so B vitamins, B12, folate. I was also looking at creatine, carnitine, and coenzyme Q. And I was thinking, because I didn't feel any different having taken all of them. And, I stayed with it for 6 months and then just said, "Ugh, it's a waste of money, and, I'm just making expensive urine, and this is crazy," so I quit. And then I realized that whatever improvement was happening had come on so slowly I couldn't recognize it. But when suddenly I didn't have those in my system anymore, then it was very apparent that clearly it had been doing something for me. Now I'm still severely fatigued. I'm still exhausted by 10 in the morning, but I have, a pretty clear thinking. And I'm like, okay, well, if all it's doing is maintaining this level of function, I guess that's worth a lot. It certainly changed my attitude about my supplements, and it changed my attitude about reading and thinking that, well, there are things I can figure out, and by gosh, it's up to me. I need to be doing something.
Yeah, what was that mindset shift? Because I mean, it's like you're realizing in real time that a potential solution to your problems might not necessarily be in the or exclusively found in the pharmacy, but in the health food store.
Yeah, I had up until that moment thought that I didn't understand why people would spend, billions of dollars on supplements that weren't FDA approved or regulated. I really believed in the latest, greatest pharmaceuticals and the best devices and the best technology. And I was pretty skeptical about complementary alternative medicine. But, it also was, definitely progressively declining. It had come to terms with, man, I got to be doing all that I can to slow this decline because I knew I couldn't recover. Um, but now, yeah, and I was relying on seeing the very best MS specialist in the country. And now I began to realize, well, wait a minute. I need to be a little more actively engaged here. I need to be doing all that I can. And, I can read the science. I could start reading and developing my own theories.
Hmm. So, what did it feel like at that point as a medical doctor, having gone through all of this training, right? Like medical school residency, to then have be faced with your own health crisis and not have the tools to help yourself in any real meaningful way?
Well, I certainly believed in the best drugs, the best technology, and I was teaching my residents the latest stuff in the New England Journal of Medicine. And absolutely, that's what I believed in. And now, I'm reading these studies, thinking about mitochondria, taking supplements, and discovering like it had an effect. It had a noticeable effect. Maybe not as big as I wanted. It wasn't getting me up out of the wheelchair. It wasn't fixing my brain, but it clearly was having some effect. And so I'm still thinking, wow, I got to keep reading. The other thing that I did at that point, I'm in the institutional review board. So I am part of the committee that reviews all the human clinical trials. And I let them know that I want to review the trials involving the brain. So that meant I was doing the psychiatry stuff, the neurology stuff, and I'm getting more comfortable reading neurology and psychiatry protocols and studies, which gets me a little more comfortable reading these trials. Because keep in mind, I am not a neurologist. I'm not a PhD person. When I did biochemistry in my basic science years, it was a chore. My undergraduate degree, I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in painting. So I did take the required science degrees, but not more than the required science degrees.
Yeah,
So
I
basic
get it.
science was definitely a chore.
Yeah, fascinating. So, um, at what point then did you make the leap from supplements to food?
Well, so in 2004, I start tinkering on the supplements, and I'm reading, slowly adding another supplement here and there. By 2007, I'm continuing to decline. I have worsening fatigue. My muscles in my torso continue to get weaker. I can no longer sit up as you and I are now. I have a zero gravity chair with my knees higher than my nose.
What is that about? I don't know, enough about MS to know why it's helpful to like to use a reclining chair and why you can't
Well,
sit up. What's going
this
on there?
this is because MS has lesions in your spinal cord, your cranial nerves, and your brain. And depending on where your lesions are, muscle groups will become weak and uncoordinated. And for me, the muscle groups in my torso, in my back extensors, and my abdomen had become quite weak. So, I could no longer sit up. We had to get a special chair that I could recline back, so gravity just to hold me in the chair.
Hmm.
And I had a chair like that in my office, one where I was staffing the residents, so residents would see patients, and they would discuss the case with me, and have another chair like that at home. Because I was too weak to sit up at the supper table. I had to, be in my zero gravity chair. And I couldn't go to restaurants. I couldn't go to movie theaters. If we were driving up to Wisconsin to see family, it would take my seat and recline it all the way back. We'd have elastic straps that would strap me in to the seat. It would take a portable zero gravity chair that I'd sit in at Wisconsin or as at bed rest. It was very clear I was headed towards becoming bedridden by my illness. And I was beginning to have, in 2007, brain fog. So concentration was more and more difficult. And my trigeminal neuralgia was more frequent, more severe, much more difficult to turn off. So likely, I mean, in my mind, I'm coming to terms with, okay, I'm going to be bedridden, probably demented, and probably my face pain will turn on. At which point, light, sound, a light touch, a breeze triggers the electrical face pain. Um, Speaking triggers the pain. Chewing, swallowing triggers the pain. So eventually, I'll choose to not talk or swallow because of the intensity of the pain. So in 2007, I rewrite the durable power of attorney and the living will such that if I stop talking and swallowing, there'll be no IV fluids, no tube feeds. And then, that means, yes, I'll have horrible pain, but, eventually I'll die from dehydration.
Hmm.
And actually, it gave me a lot of comfort to know that, okay, there would be an end in sight.
Wow.
Yeah. So 2007 was a pretty tough place. So that's where I'm at. And my boss, chief of staff, calls me in July to tell me that he's going to have me start staffing residents. Pardon me. I'm going to start seeing patients in the traumatic brain injury clinic as part of a multidisciplinary team. I'll be examining the patients and giving them their primary care. As he describes the job, it's more physically demanding than what I know I can do. And so that's pretty tough to hear. Like, okay, in 6 months, I'll go. I either can do this job, probably can't, and then I'll have to apply for medical disability.
Hmm.
Um, and then 2 weeks later, the packet that I get for the IRB, the research I'm reviewing, uses electrical stimulation of muscles in people who've had a traumatic spinal cord injury. So I think that's really pretty interesting. I want to buy a device. So I read the 212 abstracts about those papers about electrical stim, and I decide that I want to try it. And I want to buy a device. Jackie, my wife, says, no, no, no. Ask your physical therapist.
Hmm.
So I meet with Dave. We talk about it. He says that this is for athletes. He uses eStim for athletes to help them recover from injuries. He can grow bigger muscles for the athletes, but he doesn't know, and he knows that he could grow bigger muscles for me, but he doesn't know if my brain could talk to those muscles. He might just be making more muscles, more weight, and making it harder to walk.
Interesting.
But he agrees to let me have a test session. It does hurt a whole lot. But when it's over, I feel euphoric. Dave tells me it's probably from the endorphins. And of course, remember, I've been very inactive. So it's the first time that I've had all these endorphins. I also now know, after reading more about eSTEM, and that we've had more research, that this electrical stimulation stimulates nerve growth factors in the brain.
Wow, interesting.
So my brain is probably getting a nice batch of nerve growth factors, which it loved, the endorphins, which it loved. And so this was really great for my mood. And so we began doing eSTEM sessions 3 times a week for the next 2 weeks. Then he got me a homegoing device, and I began slowly adding the electrical stimulation to my small little workout that I was doing every day. About that same time, I discovered the organization, the Institute for Functional Medicine. And I took their course on neuroprotection. And I loved it because they were talking about mitochondria and biochemistry. And they also agreed with me that mitochondria were the driver of neurodegeneration for Parkinson's, for Alzheimer's, for cognitive decline. They didn't mention MS at all, but I figured, no. That I was convinced that mitochondria were the driver for progressive MS. So now I have a longer list of supplements, and I'm doing my eSTEM. Yeah, I'm up to 15 minutes twice a day, and then I have a really big aha. And in retrospect, it's very embarrassing how long it took me to have this aha. So earlier, my neurologist had mentioned the work of Ashton Embry, whose son had MS, who remarkably improved when he adopted the paleo diet. And so after looking at Ashton Embry's work, I then got turned on to Lauren Cordain. And it was a big deal because I'd been a vegetarian for 20 years. After reading Cordain's works and his books, and a lot of prayer and meditation, I went back to eating meat. And so I'd given up all grain, all dairy, and all legumes in 2002. The next year, I needed a tilt recline wheelchair. I'm going steadily downhill. But I figure, if my brain is having to rebuild my brain and spinal cord, that might take 7 or 10 years. So at least I'm doing something. And I add these supplements, and the supplements clearly are doing something because if I don't take them, I feel way worse. And then I have this big aha, like, what if I redesign my paleo diet based on the supplements that I'm taking? So now I do some work to figure out, okay, where are these nutrients in the food supply? And I start this new way of eating December 26th. Then January rolls around, and now I have to go to this new clinic. So the first 2 weeks, it's the traumatic brain injury clinic. I am in my tilt recline wheelchair, watching my partners, examine these vets. It's like, okay, I should be able to do that. I'm just watching. The third week, that first day on Monday, I examine my veterans, stand up, do the exam, sit down, write the note, then do the next person. And at the end of the day, I think, well, that wasn't too bad. And then we have 3 more clinics. At the end of the week, Jackie and I are like, that really wasn't too bad. And then, Max, I say, I think I could try sitting at the table. And, so we get a regular desk chair out, and I sit at the table, and I have supper sitting up in a regular desk chair. Like, that's a really big deal.
Wow.
And at the end of the month, I'm like, I think my energy is improving. And, I think I have a little more mental clarity. And then in February, my physical therapist says, Terry, I think you're getting stronger. And he advances my exercises. And then at the end of February, um, I, I've sort of swapped out my tilt recline wheelchair for a scooter. I have my uh, walking sticks in my office. And I decide that I'm going to mail a letter, but I'm not going to drive to it. I'm going to walk. I grab my walking sticks and I walk, maybe the 40 yards to mail the letter and come back. And my colleagues are like, "Oh my God, Dr. Wahls, you are walking.
Hmm.
What what happened?" Because they haven't seen me do that in 4 years.
Wow. It had been 4 years.
Yeah, otherwise, I'm in the tilt recline wheelchair. I had not walked around the hospital for 4 years.
Wow.
Then next thing that happens that's really pretty cool. So I'm now walking around the VA hospital, first with walking sticks, then without walking sticks. Then every 2 years, you're supposed to meet with the chair of medicine. It was time for me to have my meeting. But it's sort of a long walk. I have to go down a hill, up a hill. It's like, it's too far. So I'm going to take my scooter. But my scooter dies on the way over. So I end up, disengaging the flywheel, pushing my scooter up the hill, and walking slowly to the chairman's office. So I'm quite late by the time I show up. And I explain, why I'm late. And he says, "Oh, it's because you had to wait for the patient mobility." I said, "Well, no, actually, I just pushed my scooter up the hill and I walked over." And he goes, "You what?" And so I showed him my electrical therapy device, explained the protocol. And Dr. Rothman said, "This is just so huge, Terry." Now, he's a rheumatologist. He takes care of autoimmune patients all of the time. And so he has a huge understanding of the fact that secondary progressive MS, like most autoimmune diseases, do not spontaneously get better. So he gives me the job of getting a case report written up. And gets me the mentors, and we get that first case report written up. And then he calls me back and wants me to write up my protocol and to do a safety and feasibility study. And that's the first study that we do, looking at, can others with secondary and primary progressive MS implement this complicated regimen that I use for my own recovery? Is it safe? Will they actually do it? And then what is the effect size?
So you wrote that up, and that began ultimately. I mean, now you're at the helm of multi-million-dollar studies at University of Iowa, correct?
Correct.
Incredible. What are some of the nutrients that you started to orient your diet around at that
Well,
point?
you know, I want your listeners to know mitochondria are key. I think for relapse remitting MS and for progressive MS, yeah, and for really any kind of neurologic or psychiatric disorder, the mitochondria have to generate enough ATP so you can make myelin and maintain the myelin. That's the insulation on the wiring. That you can maintain the brain cell and the supportive cells around the brain. If you don't have enough ATP, your myelin's going to break down. You'll be more likely to have acute relapse. You'll be more likely to get into the atrophy and the shrinkage. So I think about that. We're looking at what are the cofactors. The first kinds of things are the B vitamins, riboflavin, so B2, niacin, B3. I would also think about thiamine, which is B1, cobalamin, B12, and folate, B9. So a B complex. And then we know that vitamins are cofactors that facilitate these enzymatic paths, but the vitamins also have cofactors as in minerals. And so particularly zinc and magnesium are cofactors for many, many of these interactions. Now, I was not as tuned in to minerals in the beginning, but I am now. originally I knew to be tuned into the B vitamins, and I was tuned into creatine, carnitine, lipoic acid, because that helps facilitate some of the transport of amino acids and fats into the mitochondria to make the mitochondria a bit more efficient.
Where do you find those nutrients? Creatine, carnitine,
Meat,
meat.
mussels, clams, oysters, heart, liver.
Hmm.
And I sort of want to acknowledge that there are people who are going to be vegetarian and vegan for their spiritual beliefs, and that's very important to them. Now, for those individuals, I'll want to have a nutritional assessment. We may need to have targeted supplements, and so that their mitochondria can function really well.
Yeah, but I'm glad that that in at this time in your life you decided to put your health first, even though you had been on a vegetarian diet for so many years. You when data presented itself to you that indicated that foods that contain these vitamins might play a therapeutic role in what you were experiencing, that you set
That's it.
aside
Mhm.
the you know the ideology or
Correct.
the dogma.
And at the time, it was a big decision. I mean, I had to do some prayer and meditation,
Hmm.
but I had very young kids, and like, okay, am I doing everything that I can for them? And I needed to think about my health, and that also had me thinking about their health. Was I compromising their brains and their mitochondria as well? So I went back to eating meat, and I made sure that they were comfortable eating meat as well.
Hmm. You also have been a big advocate over the years for the consumption of dark leafy greens. Correct me if
Yeah,
I'm wrong.
absolutely. Dark leafy greens, vitamin K, carotenoids, zeaxanthin, mesozeaxanthin, lutein. These are fabulous nutrients for your retina and for your brain. They're associated with better cognitive performance, better vision. They are the nutrients that protect our eyes from the ultraviolet light that we need our eyes to see, so the clock sensing parts of our brain know what time of day it is.
Hmm.
So our circadian rhythm is going to work. So our hormones are all timed and synchronized. So we need that ultraviolet light. If we don't have all of those dark leafy greens, we won't have as much lutein, zeaxanthin, mesozeaxanthin, and we're going to have more cataracts. We'll have more retinal damage. We'll have more visual compromise.
I love that your message is so balanced. Well, I often talk a lot about the value of dark leafy greens, and I get pushback from carnivores. There's this
Oh yeah.
growing trend.
Well, we can talk about the carnivores. So I certainly agree that humans we appear to have originated from equatorial Africa. Our ancestors ate a whole lot of greens. Over time, we added more meat to our diet, more fish, shellfish, and we grow bigger brains. Then we eventually migrate into the Arctic and into ecosystems that have very little plant material. And that we have a few societies that have very little um, uh, plant vegetation for large parts of the year. For example, the Arctic dwellers. They will have uh, seal oil, whale blubber, and they'll have some organ meats, stink fins, and they're terribly constipated during the winter. Long winter, and it's incredibly cold. They're in their snow shelters, and it's probably to their advantage to be severely constipated and not going outside in that terrible cold.
Hmm.
And they have a fair amount of snow blindness. Sort of interesting because of the harshness of their element. And they know to eat liver a little bit. Don't eat too much so they don't become poisoned by the heavy amounts of vitamin A. The vast majority of our history, the vast majority of our cultures have existed eating 200 different plant species every year, probably hundreds of different animal species every year, and we've had tremendous reproductive success. I, um, and the fact that, yes, we do have some societies that have lived large parts of their year seasonally eating only animal products. I, I think that's a huge step to go from a few societies do that for parts of the year to this is all I'm going to eat forever.
Yeah.
And it's also a huge leap to say plants are terrible for us. I certainly agree that there are compounds in plants that plants put in there to ward off the insects and humans that want to eat them. I completely agree. However, my carnivore friends are very fond of hormetic stress, saunas, ice baths, high intensity interval training, fasting, strength training. We agree hormesis is good. They forget that our plants are hormetic stressors for us as well. As long as we have diversity in the plants we consume, then I can take advantage of the hormetic stress from the kale, and I eat it, 4 or 5 days later again, another hormetic stress from the kale. And if I have a wide variety of plants that I'm consuming, now I'm getting all the health benefits of that hormetic stress, which makes my biochemistry run more efficiently and more smoothly.
I love that. Yeah, it's a form of chemical hormesis,
Mhm.
right? Saunas are a form of physical hormesis, extrinsic hormesis, right? When you're exercising, and for people who are unfamiliar with the term, it's basically like beneficial stress, right? Like a low dose.
Mild to moderate stress, followed by a period of rest and recovery from which my cell can repair the damage that was given to that cell from that mild to moderate stress. I'm a former athlete. Well, actually, no, I'm an athlete. When early in my career, I went through a period where I was running 85 to 100 miles a week. Loved it. I was doing taekwondo, plenty of high intensity interval stuff, and I was probably overtraining.
Hmm.
I was pushing myself too hard, and I was getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and I was getting really pissed at myself. Now, was that overtraining? Was it the beginning of my MS and it was already sapping my athletic strength? Both could be true.
Fascinating. So it just goes
Yeah,
to show you that exercise it's good for you in a way because it's bad for you, right? If
correct.
you do too much of it,
It becomes bad.
it becomes bad. Yeah. So I love the idea that these plants actually impart benefit to people who eat them via
Yeah.
this a similar pathway, albeit a chemical one.
The other observation that I want to make, and I try to stress this, anytime you have a nutrition expert tell you that their diet is the only one that works, quit listening to them because humans, we've had tremendous reproductive success in a wide variety of ecosystems, eating a wide variety of foods. So there will be many foods that we can thrive with. There's one food that we know that is really terrible for us. That's the standard westernized diet, high in added sugar, processed foods, fast foods. Uh, that is associated with worse health outcomes. And there are a variety of paths that are associated with very good outcomes.
A wide variety. The Mediterranean dietary pattern, the Japanese dietary pattern.
The Nordic dietary pattern, many of our traditional societies have uh, dietary patterns that their society has evolved consuming over, again, thousands or millions of generations.
Yeah. I love it because I definitely disagree with the carnivores, and whenever I post about the value of dark leafy greens, which are one of the most nutrient dense foods, um,
Tremendously good for us.
yeah, and then you've got the vegans
Yeah,
who might say something like, you saw all these benefits to your neurological health, when you started integrating more animal products, but your LDL might have gone up in the process.
Well, we actually measure lipid values in all of our clinical trials, and we've published them in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Thus far, in every study that we have completed, total cholesterol went down, HDL went up, LDL went down, triglycerides went down.
Wow.
Now, will that happen for every individual? No, we certainly want to see what their diet is, monitor their lipids, and respond appropriately. Yeah, their lipid values typically improve. And the big driver of poor lipids, poor cardiovascular outcomes, sugar, 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 and processed foods. If you eat meats, if you eat vegetables, for the vast majority, lipids are going to improve.
Yeah, it's really it's the processed junk food. I think that's the big problem.
That is the big problem.
Okay, so you started to orient your diet around a sort of modified paleo
Correct.
diet.
So in 2002, I take out all grain, all legumes, all dairy. I'm eating meat and vegetables. It's really the AIP diet as it was described to me then, or as Lauren Cardin described it in his book. And when in 2007, instead of focusing on what not to eat, I was focusing on what to eat.
Hmm.
That was really very interesting. And at first, I had these long list of foods that I should be stressing. When I rode the bike for the first time, and then rode the bike for 18 miles, and like, okay, it's really changing how I'm thinking about disease and health. And I want to start teaching these concepts to my patients. Now I can't just give them a list of foods to eat. Now I have to think of, okay, what are some easily taught lessons that I can teach? Because I only get about 5 minutes with the patients when I'm staffing residents, 20 minutes when I'm seeing them in my traumatic brain injury clinic. That's still not that much time. I need to create an easy lesson plan. So, I worked at this, and that's how I eventually came up with, okay, I knew we did the greens, we did the cabbage, onion, mushroom family, and the deeply colored vegetables. And I was seeing mostly men. I needed them to not be hungry. So it was 2 palm-sized servings of meat and 3 plates of vegetables
Per day?
per day. And they're like, is that per week or month, doc? And I said, no, that's per day. Oh my God, are you sure?
Why? Because they thought that sounded like a lot?
It sounded like a lot. It was terribly disorienting.
Why mostly men? Why were you seeing mostly men at the time?
Because I was at the VA.
Oh,
and the VA has a strong predominance of men.
Got it.
Although there's certainly more and more women in the VA system as well.
And so what kind of responses were you seeing?
Well, in the traumatic brain injury clinic, when I came, they were telling these vets, well, there's nothing we can do for you. They'll get whatever improvement. We'll give you some psych drugs to keep you from being violent.
Oh, because in the VA, a lot of them were presenting with brain injuries?
Right. So the traumatic brain injury clinic, people had a blast exposure and neuropsychiatric symptoms.
Wow.
And so they referred to the clinic. My partners had said, there's nothing we can do for traumatic brain injury. We'll give you psych drugs to keep you from control your rage and give you a smartphone to try and give you prompts to manage your life. I come in, Max, and I say, wait a minute, there's a whole lot we can do. We can fix your diet. We can get you a step counter, and I'll have you take Epsom salts baths.
What would be the purpose of that? Epsom salt bath?
To replenish the magnesium, to help detox, to help them calm, because they have such sympathetic overdrive because of the psychological trauma of war.
I love Epsom salt baths.
Oh man, so do I. And I try to convince parents to have their kids take Epsom salts baths because so many of our children have so much anxiety, and this will help their kids calm down immensely as well.
Do we know whether or not we absorb magnesium transdermally, like when we're sitting in a bath with magnesium salts in it? That's what Epsom salt is, correct?
Mm-hmm. You're absorbing it transdermally. Wow. And it's another good reason to have Dead Sea mineral soaks because you'll get the trace minerals.
Wow, interesting. That's
So
so
yes,
great.
yeah, and magnesium gel, a topical that can be very nice as well.
Mm,
And if you have problems with low stomach acid, you'll get more magnesium through your skin than through your stomach.
very good to know.
Yeah, very helpful.
Wow. Okay, so you're in the VA and you're like, no, 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 wait. There's a lot we
There's a
can
lot
do.
we can do, and so I'm talking, and I'm writing little notes to the vets about greens, sulfur-rich color, and meat. Cut out the sugar and cut out gluten. And so I'm doing that for several months, getting great results. People are doing really well, but my partners are really upset because is not the standard of care. So the next thing I know, I am hauled into the chief of staff's office, who says, "Terry, what's going on? Your partners are complaining. What are you doing?" Now, fortunately, I had known that this day would be coming, so I had brought with me some scientific papers to explain why I thought nutrition was so important for the traumatic brain injury folks. But John says, "But it's not the standard of care. You have to do the standard of care."
Mm.
And my response was, "Well, of course, John, if you send out an email to all of the university faculty that we have to follow the standard of care, that we can't use the latest science to guide our treatment plans, of course I'll follow that." And then I sit back and I smile. And I wait and we watch each other for a few minutes. And then John says, "Well, if anyone gets hurt, you're going through peer review." I'm like, "Of course, John. Of course I go through peer review if anyone gets hurt." And in the end, John becomes a huge fan. He also tells me that I need to go to the uh, complementary alternative medicine clinic at the university to learn how to talk about what I'm doing, so I'm not upsetting my colleagues.
Oh.
And said, "And you have to learn how to talk about this in the public because I see you're doing talks now for the organic grocer because we can't have you losing your license over this stuff." And so actually, I'm really grateful that John called me in and sent me to the complementary alternative medicine clinic. And I did learn that I shifted my message to make it very clear that I'm just working on improving your health. Your other people are going to treat your chronic disease states. I'm going to work on improving the health of your cells, and then I'll watch for side effects because your blood pressure might fall, your blood sugars might fall. We may have to adjust your medications. When I was much more careful to say, "This is what I'm doing, and I'm watching for side effects," then my partners were much less concerned.
It's amazing the pushback that that you would get when recommending something as safe and innocuous as just eat healthier, take a bath with some. I mean, Epsom salt has been used for
For a long time.
for a long. Yeah, I mean, so these are
Well,
not revolutionary.
I'm more calm about all this because you and I also resist change. We have a current understanding of the world, whatever that is. And there's so much more information coming to my brain than what I can process. I'm mostly ignoring most of that information. And if it doesn't fit into my understanding of the world, I just don't see it.
Mm.
And so my partners couldn't understand the role of vegetables, meditation, and exercise in the treatment of traumatic brain injury. That just was extraneous information. But as eventually over time, they could tell that they could see a big difference for the people who saw me than the people who came through and I never got to see them. And likewise, in the primary care clinic, where the residents were staffing with me, what they discovered was I was incredibly skilled at getting their patients interested in vegetables
Mm.
and picking up a step counter and adding these Epsom salts baths. And the fact that I could get half of the primary care vets to start eating vegetables and half the traumatic brain injury vets to start eating vegetables. And when they did, their health improved. And their blood pressures improved, their blood sugars improved, and we're simplifying their drugs. such that eventually the chief of medicine at the VA called me into his office to say, Terry, I'm pulling you out of primary care. And then the next thing that really surprised me, he said, because I want you to start your own clinic. What you're doing is remarkable, and we need to have you seeing patients so you can treat them the way you want to be treating them. Now, we had we set up that clinic. We called it the Therapeutic Lifestyle Clinic. I went to the pain clinic, specialty medicine, primary care, and my pitch was, I want to see people who have pain, fatigue, brain fog that you can't really help. I'm not going to use drugs or just doing diet and lifestyle. And send me your worst cases. So we got a few, and we had great success. And then we got a few more. We had great success. And then I kept having to redesign that clinic because we'd have more and more people coming. And I did not want people to have to wait. So we went from small group visits to large group visits to classrooms.
Wow. I mean, the community aspect too. Like, I'm assuming when you get people with similar needs into a classroom, the degree of adherence among
Well,
individuals is likely going to be higher, right?
much, much higher. What I've learned is, getting a health coach to work with you one-on-one, very helpful. You'll be much more successful implementing whatever diet and lifestyle things that I've recommended. If I bring you together in a group, now, in addition to hearing what I have to say and my health coach has to say, you hear what the peers are saying to each other. And we can be saying the same message, but I assure you, when the peers are talking about how their lives are being transformed, when the peers are talking about how delicious the vegetables can be, how this can be affordable, how they can get their children, their spouse, and their grandchildren on board, and that people are so encouraging that more seasoned folks in the therapeutic lifestyle clinic would take on the newbies. It was magical. My vets taught me the power of groups for behavior change.
Amazing. At that point, had you been familiar with the work of Mary Newport, who's another sort of rock star in the space, uh, advocating for like ketones and the
Yeah,
like?
yeah. So in I would meet Mary a little bit later. I should fill in for your audience that ever since I've been an adolescent, I have struggled with depression. It has been a huge burden for me. I did fortunately discover that when I exercise, my depression is more manageable. And when I couldn't exercise, my depression was much worse. That was a big problem. When I could start exercising, doing my e-stim, that certainly helped my mood a lot.
Wow.
Then, and when I was a vegetarian, I'm eating a lot. Although I wasn't having a lot of sugars, it's a lot of carbohydrates. I now know that I had early antibiotics before the age of 3, so that suppressed my bacteria. It caused my sugar-loving yeast to bloom, and because it happened before the age of 3, in my bowels, I have too many sugar-loving yeast, which is associated with greater rates of anxiety and depression.
Mm.
Now, over time, I have figured out that having steadily fewer and fewer carbs, my mood is much better. So I'm now much more of a ketogenic eater. Still have plenty of greens. I'll have non-starchy, cabbage, onion, mushrooms, and some non-starchy color. I don't have much fruit. If I have more carbs, my mood's not as good.
Hmm.
And I work on metabolic flexibility. So I'll have more ketogenic days. Then I have days where I have a little higher protein intake, still a moderate carbs, because again, if I get that bloom of yeast, I can tell my mood suffers.
Interesting. And there's probably a degree of customization that people can utilize with regard to daily carb intake, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure like people who are listening to this, some are regular gym rats, athletes,
Yeah,
bodybuilders, and the like. So I mean, carb tolerance, I think, is probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, going to vary person to person.
it varies according to your physical activity. It'll probably vary by your genetics and your microbiome. For those of us who have the early antibiotics and have a yeast overgrowth, we will probably not tolerate as many carbs. Um, again, it varies, which is why when I write my books and in my clinical practice, I remind people that I have a range of options for you to consider. We have basically 4 dietary plans in my book, and it's based in part on your symptoms. But I want families to begin to eat together as a family, to have a conversation with what are we going to add, what are we going to reduce, and what are we going to eliminate. And start with small changes, and you can go further and deeper into the dietary intervention according to what your family needs are.
Yeah, it it's it's so true. I mean, I love the whole idea of like, framing this around what to add more of. Um,
You'll be much more successful if you start with here are the things we're going to add. We'll get the additions going. Then we'll talk about what we're going to reduce, and then have a conversation what we're going to eliminate. And then if you're going to eliminate something, get it out of your line of sight because these foods are delicious, they're tasty, they're cheap. If they're in your line of sight, they will find your mouth and you'll begin chewing.
yeah, I say keep it out of the house.
Yeah. Well, that's a family conversation. If you keep it out of the house, you'll be much more successful. But for some families, the agreement is we'll keep it out of the immediate eating environment.
Hmm.
But there will be places in the house where people could go eat the food that you have personally have eliminated. Um, and then over time, many of these families migrate to okay, that allowable space is going to be smaller and smaller and smaller, and then hopefully eventually not in the house. Although the reverse can also happen that when you're first making the decision, say to go gluten free, that it can't be in the house because we're so addicted. Then after 3 or 4 or 5 years, I'm not bothered. I'm not tempted by gluten. Then if my spouse wants to have some gluten in front of me, it's not going to be a problem.
Yeah, I get it. I like the idea of flexibility. I was going to ask, do you think that the early exposure to antibiotics could have possibly played a role in the development of MS?
Oh, absolutely. So, the sequence for me was probably I have the genetic vulnerability. There's 200 to 300 genes that increase your risk just a little bit for having MS. Then I have exposure to one of these infections that increase the risk for developing an autoimmune problem. And I assure you, if you're listening to this podcast, you've been exposed to one of these microbes, but the vast majority don't get an autoimmune problem. So in my case, I know I have DQ2, DQ8, which means if you do get gluten sensitive, you're likely to have severe disease. And so I had those genes, I had the early antibiotics, I had the yeast overgrowth. We know yeast overgrowth increases the probability of leaky gut. The incompletely digested food proteins got into my bloodstream. So gluten spills into my bloodstream. My immune cells react, they get sensitized. They also get sensitized to dairy, casein, and we know they get sensitized to eggs. During, and that probably happens sometime between age 2 and 10, would be my guess. Then, when I become an adolescent, I begin having mild reactive airways disease. I begin having depression. I begin having really intense periods, heavy bleeding, heavy cramps. I would later learn that I'm infertile. I have severe endometriosis. I have migraines. I have mild reactive airways. We now know, that endometriosis is an autoimmune problem. Migraines, anxiety, depression certainly have immune dysregulation as part of that. And then, so the autoimmune processes were established, and that was a part. I take it all the way back to that early antibiotic and leaky gut.
Hmm. Do you think there's a rationale to talk about like autoimmune prevention, which is not a topic that I hear
Mhm.
brought up a lot, but like if you were going to design like an autoimmune prevention protocol for families, what might that look like? Maybe having
Yeah,
like a
yeah,
dog in the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
house, you know?
Well, breastfeed.
Mm.
First thing, breastfeed, breastfeed, breastfeed. Now the recommendation is to go at least 2 years. Maybe it should be 3 years, 4 years. I think for most of humanity, uh, we breastfed to age 4 or 5, and that's probably much more prevalent through the rest of the world. At least breastfeed to age 2. Try and be sure that your vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin K, your fat soluble vitamins are optimized. So, liver once a week. Get dirty, play in the mud. I think there's some evidence that cats and dogs may be beneficial. Um, Being on a farm, if you happen to be a farm person, that's beneficial. A wide variety of foodstuffs are really very helpful. There is debate. Um, does having gluten, dairy, and eggs early in life, is that protective? If is going gluten-free, dairy-free as a child increase the risk of being gluten sensitive later in life? I don't think the answer is known yet. Um, Eat together as a family. Be sure that you have your children helping you cook using recipes as toddlers. You know, they can do little basic things, stirring with the wooden spoon, helping sort the salad, so that when they are in grade school, they can help with supervision actually make food, because um, we know that if we eat together as a family, there is better scholastic performance throughout grade school, junior high, and high school, better academic performance in community college or in college, and better job performance later in life.
I love that. I love all of those recommendations. Dairy is an interesting one because I mean we're adapted to consume dairy at least for a certain period in our lives,
Yep.
right?
Yeah. So through most of, well, let's go back. For 200 million years, we've been rearing our young with lactation products, milk. And then 250,000 years ago, Homo sapiens are on the scene. We, again, for most of that time, we've been weaning our young about age 5, then they don't have any more milk. About 10,000 years ago, the Europeans in some parts of Africa domesticate a variety of animals, and we have milk, which adds more protein in the diet. Maybe that's why the Europeans had economic success and were a dominant culture for large parts of history. On the other hand, milk has a lot of growth factors in it, which is really helpful to grow your young. It's really helpful, maybe to age 5, very clearly, maybe to age 12 or whenever it is your growth plates fuse, maybe helpful. Once your growth plates fuse, those growth factors can help me grow horizontally, not very helpful, or help me grow uh, uh, and become dysplastic
Mm,
or cancerous, also
mm.
not very helpful. So and we know that milk has some molecular mimicry with some brain structures.
Mm.
So if I'm going to have a leaky gut, get those milk proteins into my bloodstream and begin to have an immune response to that, then it will begin to also have an immune response to brain structures. Also, not very helpful. Milk is delicious. Ice cream is delicious. Cheese is delicious. I can appreciate why people often do not want to give up their dairy.
Are you familiar? I've become obsessed with this concept lately. It's a fairly novel concept to me, but that of antagonistic pleiotropy.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, it's basically a top shelf SAT phrase for the concept that certain things that are good for you at one stage in life are bad for you at other stages in life
Hmm.
because we've evolved to we've evolved to um, reproduce, right? Not necessarily to live a long time. So, for example, like how you were describing dairy, it's great for a certain period in our lives, right?
Hmm.
But might not be as helpful for other
Later in
periods
life. Yeah.
later in life. Yeah. Um, there are a lot of genes that are that show that sort of illustrate antagonistic pleiotropy. For example, the ApoE4 allele, which at one end of the age spectrum puts you at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, right?
Hmm.
But earlier in life seems to boost efficiency in the brain, be associated with better problem solving, higher levels of fertility. So it's like this double edged sword,
Interesting.
right?
Very interesting.
So that's really what that's all about. But and I've just barely started to scratch the surface on that topic, but I think it's really cool.
Hmm.
You know, because we're designed. Evolution has set us up to be at our peaks at around 25 or whatever,
Well, 15 to 25.
15 to 25, yeah,
Hmm.
and then it essentially sweeps us under the rug, or it keeps us around long enough so that we can be good grandparents,
Right.
right?
Grandparenting was a very useful developmental process. So yeah.
It's super cool. But dairy, I mean, the growth stuff I think is interesting because you know, like obviously the hyperplastic aspect of things is not good, but like isn't IGF-1 and you know associated with neuroplasticity at least like an mTOR, which we know has a dark side, can be associated when it's like overactivated with cancer. It's also really important for growing and maintaining muscle mass,
Right.
right? These are all, by the way, good examples of
You
antagonistic
know,
pleiotropy.
and if you think about life in general is a sine wave.
Hmm.
You know, we have day and night, wakefulness and sleep periods. Most of our physiologic processes occur within a range where they ebb and flow. And you know, mTOR, we need a period of growth and we need a period of repair. Uh, so I think the ebb of flow of most, uh, I'm beginning to think that most of our processes are this biologic ebb and flow. Walking, running, it's the ebb and flow of your right leg and your left leg, your arms and your legs.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. I also think about it in terms of like trade-offs. You know, like you can eat and live in a certain way that's going to give you the most muscles
Correct.
and the most strength.
Well, it's part of why I've shifted my eating towards this stressing metabolic flexibility, being low carb, and then being and more ketogenic, high in fat, then being moderate fat, higher in protein, and moderate carb, and going back and forth between the two. And in my workouts, I'll have strength training workouts, and I'll have endurance workouts,
Hmm.
and then I'll have balance training workouts. So I think to me, there's more wisdom in having a cyclic pattern.
Yeah, I agree. Are you still doing the Eastim stuff?
I am. I like doing e-stem. I like doing vibration plate. So I have a variety of devices that I use and a variety of workouts that I use. And I'm jogging. I'm so excited about that.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
You really are an inspiration and have been an inspiration to so many. What's next for you?
Well, we have a very exciting clinical trial. And I'm pleased to tell you this is our eighth clinical trial. We are studying the ketogenic diet, the modified Paleolithic diets, basically Wahls elimination, and usual care diet. People with relapsing remitting MS, they'll come into Iowa month 0, will get baseline MRI, walking, hand, vision, memory function, quality of life, and fatigue measures. Then we'll get an MRI without contrast. And so we can then randomize them into one of the 3 diets, bring them back in 3 months for repeat lab values, and then bring them back at 24 months. The main hypothesis is, will one of these intervention diets lead to better quality of life at 6 months than the control diet? And then at between month 0 and month 24, what's the effect of diet on function, quality of life, and the brain volume? I think a really important observation, excuse me, is that people who enroll in dietary studies want to improve their diet. And I have to disclose to everyone in the study what the 2 diets are. We describe the ketogenic diet, we describe the paleo diet, and that the usual diet people get to eat what they're eating now and continue on that. They really wanted to be on one of the intervention diets.
Mm.
We know that every dietary intervention study, the control diet, improves their diet. They're not going to eat the standard American diet. They're going to do something that's better. It's quite possible that all 3 groups are going to improve, and we think that they probably will in terms of quality of life and their function. So that might be a negative study. But if what I'm able to show that brain volume loss, which in MS is 3 times as fast as healthy aging.
Wow, 3 times.
So healthy aging is 0.1, 0.3% per year. MS is 0.7 to 1% per year.
Wow.
If by adopting a healthy diet, the ketogenic diet, the paleo diet, or an improved usual care diet, we get everyone back to healthy aging, that will be huge. That will be just phenomenal.
So interesting. Why is the brain shrinking in MS? Is it just it's the volume of myelin is
Well, the that's a big point of debate. We had thought that that was because of inflammation, and that certainly is part of it. But I also think it's the mitochondrial dysfunction, that we are losing axons. So the axons, that's the wires, they're breaking and dying. We are having greater loss of brain cells as well, and we're having greater loss of the myelin. So the myelin sheath is thinner. So it's probably multifactorial. We have drugs that turn off the inflammation. No one is talking to the patients about improving their mitochondria. I'm one of the few people talking to them about improving their diet. I'm one of the few people saying, you got to do everything. You got to fix your diet, meditate, exercise, fix your sleep. You want to take care of your whole lifestyle so you have the best brain possible.
I love that. I agree. Is the hypothesis that the ketogenic diet is going to outperform the
Well, that's a
paleo?
big question. Which one will be better? I don't know. There's reason to think the ketogenic diet will outperform the paleo. There's reason to think the paleo will outperform the ketogenic diet because it may be easier to sustain long term.
Mm.
It may be that they're both equivalent, and it may be that the people in the usual care arm improve their diet enough that while they aren't quite as good as the ketogenic diet and the paleo diet, I predict that they're going to be way better than the standard American diet. And we will be assessing what people are eating so we know if people were adherent to the keto diet, if they were adherent to the paleo diet, and were they following the standard American diet or were they following something that's healthier than the standard American diet in the usual diet arm?
Got it. Yeah. Well, I mean, what would that be like the my plate paradigm, right?
Yeah. So we're giving them a lot of resources from the My Plate in terms of how to reduce the added sugar, how to reduce the processed food, eat more vegetables. We'll give them little cooking videos, cooking recipes. So we'll give some support to the usual diet arm. And if they do make those changes, they will be improving their diet.
Right. Yeah, because the standard American diet is the standard American diet is crap. You know,
Yeah, it's 1.5 servings of vegetables a day. Pretty terrible.
1/2 serving.
1 1/2.
1 1/2 servings. Wow. Yeah, no bueno. Lots of fast food, lots of ultra processed junk.
It's 60 to 70% of the calories are added sugars and processed foods.
Yikes. Yeah, any improvement on that? Oh my God, bound to be helpful. Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Being held when you're upset. I mean, when we're upset, our nervous system is reacting to a perceived threat. We don't actually feel safe. And the way our nervous system is wired, and we're wired to co-regulate with another human. So if that human's not there, that moment of upset is really big and really overwhelming for us as children.